afternoon. Welcome, everyone. This is our first fall 2023 Black and Indigenous Speaker Series talk. We're really pleased to welcome you to this talk. The series is organized through the Mount St. Vincent University Research Office. Thank you to Liz for all things logistics. Thank you to Elle Jones, our wonderful presenter that you'll hear from today. And just before, hi, welcome, please come on in. There's also coffee and tea and cookies outside if anybody can water. Please help yourselves. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Mount St. Vincent University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which was first signed by the British Crown. Please come on in. In 1725. It's important to note that these treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact it recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established rules for what would become an ongoing relationship between nations. Mount St. Vincent University acknowledges with deep respect the long history of cultural traditions of the Mi'kmaq, and are committed to maintaining and building relationships built on the principles of mutual respect, trust, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. We also acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude for those ancestors of African descent who came to this land before us. So following Elle Jones' talk, we'll open the floor up to questions and answers. And we'd be grateful for your feedback, specific to Elle's talk, obviously, but to the series as a whole. If you have particular Black or Indigenous speakers that you would like to hear from, please let Liz know. We'd be happy to entertain your thoughts and ideas about the speaker series in general, but also in terms of other speakers you'd like to hear from. So I'm going to stop there and turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Jackie. So I'd now like to ask Josel Henley to come up and introduce Elle. She's a second-year student in the Graduate Studies in Lifelong Learning.
Today's guest for MSVU Black and Indigenous Speaker Series is Dr. Elle Jones. Elle Jones is a spoken word poet, journalist, and community activist. She's a professor in Mount St. Vincent University Politics, Economics, and Canadian Studies Department, and served as the Nancy's Chair of Women's Studies for the 2017-2019 term. Elle is the author of Live from the Afrikan Resistance and her most recent book, Abolitionist Intimacies, which won the Evelyn Richardson Award for Best Nonfiction Book in Nova Scotia in 2023. Elle was the 5th Poet Laureate of Halifax in 2016. She was also the recipient of the Burnley Rocky Jones Human Rights Award for her community work and work in prison justice. She is a co-founder of the Black Power Hour, a live radio show with people who have experienced incarceration on CKDU that creates space for people inside to share their creative work and discuss contemporary social and political issues. Thank you for taking part in this series. We are excited to hear your presentation titled Loving Dogs, Loving Dogs, Weaponization of Police Dogs.
It sounds like my email's on, but I daren't touch the computer.
Yeah.
You're hearing my...
You could if you want.
Do you want to?
If you want.
Yeah. I don't know if you're hearing it. There it is. Okay.
Good.
Yes, perfect. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. The first question I get for people who are familiar with my prison work is, how did you end up in animal studies from there? And the answer is through working with families who had loved ones die in encounters with police dogs, particularly Indigenous families and Black families. There was also, while I was doing prison work, there's a famous case in the animal world. You guys may not know about it, but the case of Happy the elephant. And this is where they tried to do a habeas corpus for Happy. So a habeas corpus is an application that challenges the conditions of confinement often used by prisoners in solitary confinement. And lawyers tried to do it from an elephant at the Bronx Zoo named Happy. And they actually did get it to the Supreme Court, although it was rejected. And when that case was going on, I got a call from the guys in prison. They're like, they'll do this for an effing elephant. They won't do it for us. So it was an interesting moment where I was getting interested in this relationship between how animals experience violence and policing, but also, of course, as people in prison pointed out, that people so rarely care about the conditions of Black prisoners and Black people in general, and often favor and humanize animals over us. And so these two things really led me on this journey of trying to apply an abolitionist lens to animal studies and thinking very much about how animals are co-opted into state violence as well and what that means for our project. So I called this Loving Dogs, Loving Cops. You can see that. So very recently in July, I don't know if people remember this, there was a big funeral procession held for a police dog named Bingo in Toronto. This was widely reported on. So Bingo was allegedly killed in an encounter with a suspect fleeing from police, although that's not actually clear. The police may have killed Bingo themselves. And so there was a big procession. In fact, I just found out when I was Googling an image for this talk that they held a second funeral at the end of September for Bingo and held another memorial. And I have to lean in because my eyes aren't good. But this quote says, "These are not animals. They are our partners, and Bingo gave his life to protect others." So I want us to hold on to that quote through this speech. These are not animals. So that there's something better about police dogs, something unique about police dogs that separates them from other animals. Interestingly enough, and this is a source of an editorial I wrote with Camille Labtruck from Canadian Animal Justice, at the very same time as Bingo's memorial was taking place, as this big public procession was taking place, in the United States and Massachusetts, 8 police dogs died in transit. So there was no air conditioning in the van. It's a heat wave. 8 dogs died. They also had signs of previous abuse. They were emaciated. Their ribs were showing. 5 more at the time of the reporting on this in hospital. Those dogs were not named. So even though animals are officers, and when Bingo dies, Bingo gets a police funeral, and they say these dogs are officers. When police dogs die in situations when they're experiencing abuse from the police, then there is no prosecution. The dogs were not even named. And in fact, you may guess in that article, they were referred to as the animals in the press release by the police. I actually FOIPOPed, I ATIPed the RCMP to ask them about deaths. We have a specific training facility in Alberta. I asked them, as you can see, to give me, I went for the last 10 years, just because otherwise if you go longer than that, they don't give you anything. And it turns out they don't even keep records. So it wasn't that there was no deaths or injuries, it's they simply don't know. So as we'll learn later in the talk, Canada has a specific law that gives enhanced penalties if you harm or kill a police dog. And this was a law that was fought for by animal justice people. But of course, again, if the dogs are dying or being injured inside these training facilities, we absolutely have no information and those records are not kept. From what we do know, by the way, only about 30% at most dogs actually make it through police training. So we have this huge amount of dogs that are actually failing out of training and are designated as high needs dogs, which often means that they cannot actually socialize with other dogs and require intensive different households. So, but we don't have those kinds of records. All right, so when I first got into this work, it was through the case of a man named Jared Lowndes. So Jared Lowndes is a Wet'suwet'en man, and if that's familiar to you, this is of course the land defense in BC, and I think this is significant. So his mother is actually a matriarch land defender. He was on a warrant, and he was in a Tim Hortons parking lot, and when the police found him, he was in fact living in a car with his own dog, a puppy, and the police, when they executed the warrant, sent a police dog through the window. Jared stabbed the dog in self-defense. The dog named Gator died, and Jared was killed in that encounter. I didn't have time to put it in this talk, but you can go on the Justice for Jared Facebook, and there's actually a video that Jared made only weeks before his death, which recounts his family history with residential schools, with settler colonializing, so from the RCMP coming and taking children away from his family, all the colonial encounters in his family, his own history of abuse and the child welfare system, his history of incarceration, and then he says that he had got some land, a white man took that land out from under him, and he ends up homeless, living in a car at one point with his daughter, and then with his dog. And he ends it by saying that he believes he will die within a few weeks, and describes himself as drifting upon the wind. So this very sad colonial story of what Jared experienced. So this section is going to take you through the 2 different memorials. So what Jared experienced in the public memorializing of his life versus what the police dog Gator experienced. You don't have time to watch the video, but you can see like people lined up in the route for gator. A lot of people bring their dogs to this kind of thing, apparently. Versus, of course, what happened when Jared's family, what you see on the left is a protest the year after Jared's death, where his family marched to the police depot to demand justice. Actually, you'll see in the next slide. No, it's the next slide after this. So just to give you some background, as I said, after Jared was shot, you can see Indigenous commenters making the point that the police dog was named 3 times in various articles and memorials before Jared was even named. So there was a huge volume of articles immediately commemorating and celebrating Gator's life, while Jared himself had not even been named in the media. When Jared's family held a memorial at the site, as you can see here, a woman in a car drove up yelling to the group of mourners, saying a dog's life was more valuable than a violent criminal. And then they further found the memorial that they had made with pictures of Jared's family desecrated, and people had destroyed those photos. So this is one of the many instances you'll see a performative empathy to animals by white settler culture. So when a police dog is harmed, everybody loves dogs, and you're a terrible person if you don't want to mourn this police dog, but accompanied by this incredible violence towards Indigenous victims and Black victims as well. On the year anniversary, his family, as I said, held a march where, for example, his mother had just got back the clothes that Jared was murdered in and was holding up these clothes with multiple bullet holes soaked in Jared's blood. And as you can see here, the RCMP issued a press release, said that they were made to feel unsafe by this procession of mothers of Indigenous victims of police violence who were laid down and held up, the bloody clothes that their children died in. And they said that people felt they couldn't use the police station because these Indigenous mothers were in the entrance. And they also took the time to say, we want to remind everybody that Gator died on this day. So they used the opportunity of a march by Indigenous mothers to reaffirm that the value of the life lost here was that of the police dog. So who is mournable here? This is Judith Butler's work, people may be familiar with. She asked this question in the context of 9/11 and terrorism. So who do we mourn, so-called terrorism, I should say. So she asks us whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose are considered ungrievable. And so what we see here is normally the equation goes humans first, everybody else next. So all non-human animals are less valuable than human beings, except in the case of things like police dogs, where suddenly the animal becomes elevated to the position of the human. And particularly if you are a Black or Indigenous suspect or accused, you get animalized in return. So as you can see, Gator is granted the human qualities of being an officer, and Jared is a worthless criminal who is animalized. So we can think here about this concept of bare life, where it is the Indigenous person who is removed from the human by virtue of his so-called crime against the dog, while the dog is performatively elevated to the position of officer and human being. But as I said again, why I'm emphasizing performatively, because had Gator, for example, died in a police training accident, he would not be treated in the same way. And in fact, in Alberta, a police officer was caught on tape kicking his dog and was never prosecuted or punished for that. In other case, so I've mentioned Jared's life. I don't want to leave out Latra Tuel, a South Sudanese refugee who was having a mental health crisis at a bus stop in Calgary in 2021. They set a police dog upon him. He had an assistive device like a cane. They believed that was a weapon. They sent a police dog. The police dog jumped at him. Latra attempted to fight him off, and he was also killed in that encounter with the police dog. The picture here is his daughter, who created an exhibit around the value of Black life in response to the death of her father. So who is deserving here? And this is the language that we start to see. So Knight and Sang, who have done one of the few studies actually on how police dogs are treated philosophically, they talk about how there's a training process where a police dog enters the process of becoming an officer. So an animal in this case moves from object to a kind of precarious adjacency to humanity. But this, of course, depends upon the police in turn being constituted as heroic. So because the police is seen as heroic and indispensable and so important to society, by virtue, dogs also become elevated, but only through being officers. We don't extend this kind of adjacency to humanity to other animals. And in fact, of course, in Canada, 99% of the animals in our society are in agricultural production. They're held in warehouses. You can't even access them. And Canada, in fact, has ag-gag laws, I sometimes rant about this in class, so some of you may be familiar with this, but it's actually illegal in Canada to take photographs of animals at farms, or to stand at the entrances of farm, or to catch photos of animals in transport. So all of those things are actually criminalized in Canada, which prevents us from actually knowing the conditions of industrial farming. So our empathy towards animals when they're police dogs or in certain select situations certainly doesn't extend to the vast majority of animals in our society in an industrial agricultural production, who we in fact criminalize people if you even attempt to bring that information out. So Gator is only mournable in this case because he is configured as an officer, he is fallen, he is on duty. You'll see the same language about Gator, he was a partner. All of these languages are applied to the animals. But I would also argue that they become particularly deserving because they're involved in the death of Indigenous or Black people, in Gator's case, an Indigenous man. Indigenous sovereignty is, of course, the greatest challenge to capitalist expansion in Canada. Indigenous consent is what is stopping pipelines. As I mentioned, Jared is a Wet'suwet'en man. That is relevant in this case in the midst of one of the largest land defenses taking place in this country, and almost globally right now. So we see that the police dogs are brought in to participate in this notion of clearing Indigenous people, and then are rewarded as human beings in return. I think it's Noah Ignatieff who once said that whiteness is conferred in return for consent to state violence. And we can see this here, where dogs not only become human beings, but they become essentially white human beings in return for being involved in state violence against Black and Indigenous people. Now, this is just a Twitter thread, so you can see the kind of discourse we saw. So saying, you know, oh, the police dog, and then an Indigenous person being like, yeah, well, an Indigenous man also died. And then they're like, well, he was worthless. He didn't even hold a job. He had a criminal record. So here we see, of course, the use of police dogs in Wet'suwet'en at the Unistoten territories. So at the same time, of course, you see dogs simultaneously being brought out to commit colonial violence against Indigenous people. This is a long slide. I highlighted the bit I wanted you to know, but I think this is an important point. So as Butler talks about, like, whose deaths do you disavow? Whose deaths are nameless? Who are the faceless deaths? And this person that I got this article from talks about how if you try to mourn animals, for example, in the butcher aisle, you'll be regarded as crazy. So if you walked through, you know, the meat section at Sobeys and cried for all the animals in that aisle, that would be a ridiculous thing. So when do animals, again, become mournable? This is also just another slide to just give you some things. So, for example, the Grand Chief said he deserves to have his name, says Jared, spoken out loud and remembered that a dog would receive more news coverage and be prioritized over his life is unspeakable and unconscionable. So, of course, we see here the same dynamic I identified to enter this talk, where this is very problematic often for Black and Indigenous people when you talk about animal rights, because not only are we consistently animalized, we live out this condition where many people notice they care about their dogs more than they care about us. And we see that happening here. But then, of course, we also see this same claiming of animals into the RCMP family. So when an officer dies, how the force response is done in consultation with the officer's family. Well, I mean, the officer's family would be the dogs you actually took him away from, many of whom may have been removed from the breeding facility. But now we're going to pretend that humans are a dog's family, which is, of course, it's not uncommon. Like, we do this as well as non-police, but we should think about that, right? Like, animals have their own families, and we want to impose ourselves into animal families while actually breaking up those families. If you've ever watched Blackfish, I often make fun of how they're like literally wearing wetsuits in the whale colors. I'm like, you are not a whale. This is actually quite common for how we relate to animals. You can see here some of the memorials to Gator. So I bet you were a good boy. I bet you were a nice dog. And this is what's emphasized in the news. So children writing tributes to Gator. Here's, of course, Jared's memorial. So whereas what we see emphasized in the pictures of Gator Memorial is childishness. Oh, you know, it's so sad. Jared's memorials, of course, made consistent connections to broader issues, so that this wasn't just about Jared's life, it's also about settler colonialism, it's about resource development, it's about the environment, it's about all kinds of different issues, general police violence. So there's obviously a much more politicized space in this memorial, whereas with the police dogs, we try to remove the idea of it being political. Oh, children are sad about this dog. So we're not even allowed to speak about police dogs. And even as we claim them as officers, God help you if you start critiquing them as police. So my friend Eric actually said, fuck bingo, fuck that dog. And then it's got a barrage of right-wingers being like, what a terrible person, what kind of disgusting, inhumane person would talk about a dog this way. These are the same people that don't want to search the landfill for Indigenous. Just to give you some more of the media, this is, you can see a memorial growing, you can see a tiny dog house. So there's actually a lot to be said about police dog memorials, both official, like statues to police dogs, and unofficial. We don't have time for it in this talk. These are some of the remnants of a different talk about that. But just to, you can see like how the public responds in this kind of call upon a form of public compassion. This is an important quote that I like. So police dogs are, as they say, placed in a species' hierarchy, so they get to occupy the role of good dogs as opposed to the bad animals. So the police dog moves from an object towards being a subject who could be the victim of a crime. But as it points out, dogs that are closely associated with human values are privileged, while other dogs are criminalized. So in particular here, we see things like pit bulls, Rottweilers. Those dogs are racialized often and then criminalized. And in fact, of course, the police will frequently shoot those dogs when they enter your house. So one of the protocols for police entry is if they believe the dog's aggressive, they will shoot your companion animal. There's many cases of this, particularly in the States. So at the same time as police dogs are sacred and you're a terrible person if you harm a dog, the police frequently harm dogs as they enter your home. There's a recent case where the police shot a golden retriever puppy that was headed towards them. Thankfully in the US, but it's not unknown here. So in Canada, as I mentioned, we have a law called Quanto's Law. This is named after a police dog that was killed in Edmonton, I want to say in 2014. And the Humane Society of Canada advocated for a law that would enhance penalties against people who harm and kill police dogs. There's no mention, as you can see, well, you probably can't see because it's a tiny slide. If you could see it, you would know that there's absolutely no mention or consideration in any of this as the high carceral rates of Black and Indigenous people in Canada, nor the fact that despite another statistic I've been unable to wrest from the RCMP, despite 2 years of trying, they don't keep race-based statistics on dog bites. But from all my research, it's really obvious that it's largely Indigenous people across the country. If you look at the lawsuits, the reports, inquiries, very obvious that it's Indigenous people who are, of course, highly incarcerated. 30+% of Indigenous people, people in prison are Indigenous people, and 50% of federally incarcerated women. In fact, I mentioned this talk to my class this morning, and someone was like, yeah, I got bit by a dog, like at the Friendship Center. It's very, very common. So in advocating for animals, the Humane Society engaged in what Justin Marceau calls carceral animal law, which is where the animal rights movement frequently separates itself from other movements for liberation and justice by advocating things like harsher penalties, while many other movements are moving towards incarceration, abolition, other forms of punishment and rehabilitation. So this is one of the reasons, again, why often racialized people don't really care about animal rights and aren't involved in this movement, because it's often at odds with our freedom goals. A word about Quanto's Law, of course, that the naming of laws is actually a really interesting thing. Laws are named for who we value, and of course, the vast majority of laws are named for white people, white victims. Only 6% of laws are even named for Black people. So essentially, a dog got named for a law before a Black person in Canada got named for a law, and that again tells you about kind of discourse of crime. So I thought dogs were officers, but I looked on the RCMP. They won't give me the training manual. Yet another ATIP the number of ATIPs that I tried to get from the RCMP on the topics of dogs. I asked for the training manual. They won't give it, but they do have a website. So here you see desired characteristics of police dogs. I want us to look at the moralizing of the dogs here. So they say perfect physical condition, but then they say even temperament, of sound character. These are moral statements. So you're now not just saying, okay, we want a dog that can bite people and be obedient. They actually attribute these kind of characteristics that are like what a good human is and what a good officer is. And that's what you're looking for in a dog. So you get this moralizing of the dog. At the same time, of course, we should never forget that despite dogs supposedly being a cop, that they have subordinate status. So here they list the characteristics of a good dog handler, which are in some ways similar to the characteristics of the dog. Emotionally disciplined, even-tempered, and then they say, understanding that your police dog partner is only a dog. I thought they were cops. So you see how we're constantly in this precarious state where it's a dog, it's a cop, it's a dog, it's a cop, and it's a cop when we want to use it for propaganda, but it's a dog. So you can see that here in their own manual, your partner is only a dog. They also, of course, breed their own dogs. So for a while they were outsourcing breeding. Now we have a centralized breeding program. Of course, this would be the female dogs. So in order to get the kind of dogs they want, they concentrate breeding. Again, this is like, you know, like, do the dogs get to consent to like what's happening to them? So of course you can see here that we started breeding our own dogs in 1999. There are 19 breeding facilities that live close to the kennels, and they produce about 100 German Shepherd pups every single year. So they need 25 to 35 dogs. They don't mention to you what happens, of course, to the other 75 dogs. Where do they go? What kind of lives do they live? In fact, there's been cases where police dogs that were rejected from training were found in a dumpster in BC. So some of these dogs end up subjected to great violence. There's also a kind of exceptionalism to animal violence that happens here. So this is from an article on the fostering of a future police dog puppy. Most puppies are taught to stay off the furniture and are actively discouraged from biting, but not Maya. Maya is a German Shepherd police puppy. So they're like, she's allowed to chew on the furniture because they don't want to discourage her from biting. I think that's messed up. So they're literally like, okay, we're not even going to discipline the dog in the way that you would train a dog because we actually want these dogs to commit this unnatural act of biting human beings. And so you see this beginning at the very early stages of training. That dog's cute. Of course, part of the reason why police dogs are valued has to do with labor. And we saw this, for example, in the comparison to Jared. Jared is unemployed, he's living in a car, so therefore he's worthless, while the dogs, of course, are engaged upon work. So you'll frequently hear they did his duty, you know, he's a hard-working animal. So while Jared is unhoused, property-less, and criminalized living in his car, so he has no value, we'll often hear about a hard-working police dog. So you'll often see in police dog propaganda all about how many hours they train, like, oh, they work so hard, they're so dedicated. So we get these like capitalist worker values projected onto animals as well. I mentioned Jared, of course, had his own dog who's also mysteriously disappeared in this hierarchy. So Jared is a criminal, so we don't have to care about him. The police dog is a hero and an innocent dog. Jared also had a dog who was killed in the encounter, and we don't hear anything about this dog. So this, of course, disrupts the claims from the state around the exceptionalism of police animals and the particular kind of love and empathy we're supposed to have for animals, because we don't care about Jared's dog at all, who was also killed in police violence. So just as Jared is disposable, so is this extraneous dog to the police narrative as well. And just to show you, like, this is, you know, you can see Jared, you can see his dog, you can see his daughters. He is a human being. His 4-month-old puppy was in the vehicle with him, and she believes he may have been defending his own dog. This is in reference to his mother when he stabbed a police service dog. But his mother said media attention and ceremonies help with the police dog have made the family a target for racist comments. So again, the idea that Jared could have been defending his loved one, the idea that he also had empathy is erased from all of this. Just to sort of finish this section, this is creepy. There are titanium teeth for police dogs is a thing. So it weaponizes their mouths, and also because their teeth get worn down. So you're actually seeing this a lot, like enhancing the teeth and the biting as well. Again, I think extremely abusive to the animals, would very much disrupt their jaws, disrupt their eating patterns. But this is something that, in fact, the police in BC put on their Twitter and then took down after public protests, where people are like, what do you mean? Like, why are you putting this stuff in their mouths? I'll say here too that somebody could do a very good paper just on the naming of police dogs. If you call a dog Gator, it's like calling a dog Bitey. And you'll like often see these names, like they give the dogs like violent names. If they're not getting kids to name them, they often name them themselves. And you'll often see like these names like Brutus or like Gator here. So they give them these particular violent names that they bestow upon these animals. Just to end this section too, because I'm talking about the violent use of animals. Of course, another vision of animals is possible in Wet'suwet'en culture. In order to become a matriarch or elder, you have to spend over a year in nature, learning about animals and understanding your connection to animals and nature. That's part of your responsibilities. Jared's mother is, of course, in a position in her own nation. And as Jared's memorial was taking place and the police were engaging in this violence, an eagle came down and circled that procession as well. So we also see there is a different form of connection to the animal world we can understand. The critique here is not of animals can't be human beings. The critique here is the terms on which it takes place. So, for example, the Coast Salish people had wool dogs that they nurtured that lived on an island and were used in their sacred blankets. And those dogs were deeply loved and nurtured. The Europeans actually committed genocide against those dogs as part of breaking the Coast Salish nation. But those dogs had a special spiritual place, and they often were treated just like human beings. So we know that we have this other model of thinking and living and loving animals that allows us to see animals as separate beings that have a status equal to our own. They don't have to be subordinate to us. All right, so why abolition? Why is this tied to my work on prisons, police violence? Obviously, it's about police, but what is my connection here? So I mentioned the data gap, but the one piece of data we do have comes from the Scott Wortley Use of Force report in Toronto. Black people represent only 8.8% of Toronto's population and represent 57.1% of police dog bites. Wortley, when I asked him how he got this statistic, said that it was given to him as raw data and he had to comb through it himself. So they didn't keep this data, but he had a literal, spreadsheet of every single use of force incident, and he picked through it and got this statistic, which is the only race-based statistic we have in Canada that I can find. I've requested it repeatedly. As I said, I've looked through inquiries, I've looked through lawsuits, and overwhelmingly Indigenous people. Someone told me that there's like 80 internal complaints at the RCMP with Indigenous people and dogs, but I also have not got my hands on that one either. Unless I want to spend my whole life in front of the Ombudsman, I don't know if I'll get this data. This is a term I use in my book, actually, the violence of the paperwork, and I think it's relevant here. So this is my idea that states actually do violence through bureaucracy. In this case, the disappearing of data is a good example of this. So Canada often claims not to have data on many things. And this is, of course, if we don't have the numbers, then it doesn't exist and you don't exist. So Sisters in Spirit, the government canceled that program when it became apparent how many Indigenous women were missing. When we were up to about 300, that was when they cut funding to Sisters in Spirit under the Harper government. The lack of statistics on Black people is endemic in Canada. And that's, of course, because they don't really think we exist. So the refusal to keep this kind of data is what I call violence of the paperwork, which is marked by the simultaneous overkeeping of records in certain respects on Black and Indigenous people, such as criminal records, files in foster care, surveillance records, and the underkeeping of other records, such as data about what is actually happening. And this is a form of disappearance. So it's very interesting that we have such a gap in data on police dogs in Canada when there's such a significant part of policing. As I said, they don't even track their own dogs. And there's actually a huge gap between the severity of dog bites and the frequency with which they take place and what you actually see at the level of official inquiries. So SIU or CERT or any of these units are supposed to investigate anything that involves a serious injury, yet you'll rarely see police bites. 17 I saw in Manitoba, and we'll talk about only 2 in Nova Scotia. So here, the Serious Incidents Response Team, or CERT, what we have, is supposed to independently investigate all serious incidents which arise from the actions of police in Nova Scotia. Public service dogs, police service dogs, are recognized as members of the K9 unit. This is from their own information. Are used to assist police officers in carrying out their duties. Both the dog and the handler can be investigated when there's an affected person. But there's only 2 investigations that I could find, one in 2014 and one in 2018. I know more people than that who've been bitten by police dogs. So I'm really curious about why these aren't actually making their way up to our oversight. I don't have time in this talk to go into it, but it's actually really interesting because in the first investigation in 2014, they say, in our previous investigations, we have found that dogs do not often bite. And I'm like, but what are those previous investigations if this is the first one? So there's like this just, oh yeah, like dogs actually don't cause any harm in our previous investigations, but it's the first investigation. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. In the second one, they go, dogs are used to hunt down children who are missing. And I'm like, and bite. They leave that out. So as a Black person, as I mentioned, there's a lot of difficulty around this topic when I start getting into this. For real reasons, Black people have been animalized throughout history. We are treated as animals. We are often treated worse than animals. And so Black people are uncomfortable with comparisons to animals. One of the things PETA often does that's deeply offensive is, of course, like compare the treatment of animals to the Holocaust or to slavery. And of course, these comparisons are deeply offensive to people when they're like, these are our experiences and you can't appropriate them out. But there is a movement that's quite recent where people have been thinking more about these ties. There's a great book, Afroism, Essays on Pop Culture and Black Feminism and Veganism by Soph and Af Ko. I won't read this whole quote, it's a really long quote. But basically they talk about, like, in thinking about the animalization of Black people and the effects on us by slavery and colonization, they also began to think about what does that mean for the animals. So if Black people are worthless because we're like dogs, what does that say about how we treat and see dogs under settler colonialism? And so beginning to make these connections allows us to start to think about how our liberation can actually, and is actually deeply tied to the treatment of animals and the violence that animals undergo, and those things aren't separate. Dogs have been used since the very first days of colonization. Columbus used dogs. Las Casas in Destruction of the Indies repeatedly talks about the use of mastiffs in torture and terror in the colonization of the Americas. There was in fact an economy of dogs between the Caribbean and the southern US, particularly during slavery. So dogs that were first bred to do violence against Indigenous people and terrorize them were then converted into dogs that would track people down and do violence to people in slavery. And there was actually, at the heart of the slave trade, was an economic trade in these dogs. So breeding the dogs, selling them to different places, particularly between Haiti, Jamaica, Louisiana, etc. Interestingly enough, Canada was absent from this, that we seem to be really focused on northern dogs. So we're really obsessed with like Indigenous dogs, and there's this rhetoric around Indigenous dogs as like less than, like they always describe them as off-white. Like, so it's always like just as Indigenous people are less than white people, Indigenous dogs are less than white dogs. But at the same time, they're really obsessed with sled dogs as working dogs. And they really want to like kind of get their hands on sled dogs while also banning interbreeding with Indigenous dogs. So there's this whole kind of settler colonial mess going on with dogs that's a separate talk, but just to say that. So animals have been present at every site of state violence and continue to be. We use them to subdue suspects by policing. They're used in prisons. We often use animals in protests, so police horses are frequently deployed against protesters. Dogs sniff drugs in prisons, at borders, and airports. Dogs were used to torture people in Abu Ghraib. The CIA experimented with using animals as spies and assassins, famously like dolphins and pigeons. Animals were used, discarded, and killed in the imperial space race, so particularly primates, but also dogs. And images of civil rights protests, of course, often feature dogs attacking protesters. Guard dogs and military dogs have been used to secure the empire for decades. And if people remember the Rumble in the Jungle with Muhammad Ali, often when I speak to African people about this topic, they all say the very first thing is that's why people didn't like George Foreman. So very famously, when Foreman gets off the plane, he's accompanied by his German shepherds. And those are the dogs that the Belgians used to terrorize the population during colonization, and people turn against Foreman. And that's part of why people embrace Ali. So these ancestral histories of violence from dogs become there's a traumatic memory. In Canada, you'll often see accounts in escaped slave narratives about the dogs. So Marianne Shadd says, our woods will not ring with the growls and howls of dogs. Many people would have narratives of escape where they would explicitly associate running from the dogs and that not having to escape the snapping jaws anymore. So there's this very visceral and ancestral experience. The Jamaican Maroons, when they come to Nova Scotia, have a memory of being threatened with the dogs by the British. So when they're fighting the British, the Maroons are eventually make a deal with the British and they're sent to Nova Scotia, and they tell Governor Wentworth that they were threatened with the Cuban dogs. So they had heard about these savage Spanish dogs, and that was part of what made them deal. So again, we see how often these dogs were used as weapons of war. As I said, police service dogs are weapons, not only physical weapons, but ideological ones, as we'll get into. There's actually some of the most frequent and severe injuries that people experience from policing. A Pivot report in 2014 in Vancouver showed that someone is bitten by a dog every 3 days. These injuries are among the most debilitating and severe. If you ever see pictures of people's injuries, like they'll tear your entire muscle out of your thigh. Like the dog is taught to bite and hold and like literally just massacre you. In fact, there's two forms of dog training, bark and hold and bite and hold. In bark and hold, the dog is taught to bark first and only bite if given the command. That is much less lethal. When LA switched to that, dog bites went down by 97%. In Canada, we still use bite and hold, where the dog is taught to bite first. So once you give the command, the dog bites and only lets go when given the command. And that, of course, is a much more violent and debilitating injury. They're also ideological weapons, as I said. They frequently do like name the police puppy contests, and you know, kids will name the dogs. Of course, people may be familiar with Paw Patrol. That movie's out right now. It's a long quote. I thought it was funny, so I stuck it on the slide. In 2020, when everybody was beginning to critique how the role of media, and particularly television shows, in promoting policing, this article says it was only a matter of time before the protesters came for Paw Patrol. And they talk about, of course, Chase in Paw Patrol. This is a classic part of police propaganda for kids. So Chase actually is accompanied by a police drone, is like his special thing, and he catches like criminal suspects. So people said, euthanize the police dog, defund the Paw Patrol, all dogs go to heaven except the class traitors in Paw Patrol, were some of the examples of people's critique. But again, that's currently in theaters. A lot of people talking about my 3-year-old's like so excited to go to the theater and watch Paw Patrol, and part of this is this police propaganda through using dogs. This picture is just funny to me. This is from like the Oilers Christmas card in like 1988. It's Wayne Gretzky, of course, the Oilers, named for like the oil patches, surrounded by a bunch of police. So just to be shady, I'm pointing out that Hockey Canada is, of course, involved in like sexual assault scandals and always has been. So hockey, which is so integral to like, you know, Canadian patriarchy and masculinity, is very heavily tied, like all sports, to military and policing as well. And I just thought this picture of Wayne Gretzky just. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the impacts on people, but what about the impacts on dogs? Police dogs, the training is extremely traumatic. The very thing that the police brag about is, of course, what shows you how dangerous this training is. They'll frequently say, oh, they train 8 hours a day. Well, why does a dog need to train 8 hours a day? Because what they're doing is profoundly unnatural. They suffer psychological trauma and injuries. Police dogs are not able to live in homes of dogs. They can't go to the dog park. So once they retire, they essentially, unless it's assumed that your handling officer will adopt the dog and continue to work with the dog. If they don't, the dogs, as I said, can frequently die or be discarded. So they're labeled as high needs and high risk dogs as a result of this training. Dogs frequently do bite officers. You know, like this is not perfect training. So you're reinforcing an unnatural act upon an animal. They have spinal injuries from going in and out of the cruisers. And again, despite the fact that they are officers, they are not entitled to pensions or health plans or anything like that. So once they are no longer of use, they are discarded. So you can see this headline here, Meet Major. He was a very good cop. Now he's retired and expensive. So I thought cops had plans. Again, I mean, I'm just going to keep emphasizing that. The other thing that you see here is, should a dog, of course, be investigated? A police dog does not receive their own lawyer. So while police officers are defended by police unions and, of course, get their full pensions while they're being investigated and get the most expensive lawyers you can buy, should a canine officer, which is extremely rare, like they always exonerate them, but in a case where a police dog was found guilty, they would be euthanized. So the dog is going to be subject to the death penalty without representation in a way that other cops are not. So there is no separate police dog union where you give the police dog its own lawyer. So should the handler say, I don't know, this dog's just crazy, like he's badly trained, the dog doesn't get a voice in it. So abolish police dogs. Dogs do not consent to be cops. They have no choice in this. They obviously cannot make a decision they want to be an officer. So this, of course, does great violence upon the animal. It does violence on our relationships with these animals as well. It's violent to nature, and it's extremely harmful in general, particularly towards racialized people, where it breaks our relationship and comradeship with animals who are, in fact, are co-revolutionaries and workers. There's a great article by Jason Raval called Animals Are the Working Class. And of course, animals have worked alongside us and continue to in many cultures. They continue to be vital to farming. They are vital to our emotional and mental needs. So the idea that rather than treating animals as vital comrades and potential co-revolutionaries, we treat them as instruments to be involved and used by the state, harmed and discarded, should concern all of us. And it's particularly harmful to our fight for collective liberation. I'll skip that slide. So just very quickly, and I'm running out of time, I just want to point out that within animal rights, there is a streak of carcerality. This is one of the big divisions right now in animal studies. Those of us pushing for animal rights to be connected to broad movements, and those who are very focused on things like higher penalties for animal abuse. And you'll often see this phrase used, animal protection. And of course, this concept of protection has a long history within white supremacy. Child protection, which involves removing children of Indigenous and Black people from their homes because the white state knows better than Black parents how to parent. Colonialization often phrased itself as protection. Residential schools were educating you. So this is what we call carceral care, where under the guise of some kind of caring, so healthcare, social work, you are in fact, of course, carrying out colonial violence. And this is part of the spectrum of punishment and policing. So this article is just about Eddie Carvery. You may remember this, that Eddie Carvery had a heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, people called animal protection on his dogs, and they sent in, immediately, animal protection came in and like removed his dogs, and there were all these headlines like, Eddie Carvery is an animal abuser. So because this man is doing this powerful protest to protest Africville and more broadly land theft and colonization against Black people, they use this idea of, well, he's bad to dogs, to criminalize him in the media. And like I said, they've never seen animal, like they don't publish the name of people that are investigated by animal protection, but they did for Eddie Carvery. You also see this in the context of war. There's just millions of articles on this. If you Google like saving dogs from Afghanistan or Iraq, you'll often see this. So again, like Iraqis are bad people because they don't care for dogs. Marines are good people because like we're rescuing dogs. In fact, they rescued a bunch of dogs from Afghanistan before they even brought in the human interpreter. And this will often be used as military propaganda as well. And these are just some examples that you will just like constantly see this. I already said this. So finally, we can imagine, as I said, a different world where we live alongside animals. Black rights and animal rights are in fact deeply connected through capitalism and settler colonialism, the very same mechanisms, of course, that enslave, colonize, steal our resources, remove us from land, and treat us as property are the exact same ideologies that read animals as lower in the hierarchy, to be used and consumed, to be used as property, to be drafted into state violence. We actually cannot understand capitalism and settler colonialism without understanding its relationship to the environment and animals. So as somebody who cares about Black liberation, despite, of course, our long history of being held down alongside animals, I want us to recognize that the case of Black liberation actually does cause us to extend our work towards animals, and vice versa. Those who care about animal rights cannot have animal liberation without caring about the liberation of Black and Indigenous people. So as Jason Herbal tells us, animals have agency, they understand their own freedom, and they are our co-revolutionaries and comrades in resistance. Methods of passive resistance are used by animals and oppressed people, and these weapons of the weak are very familiar to how animals resist as well. So we can tell another story where we see police dogs breaking through their training to speak back to state violence. Here we have one example, which is still reading about one of the shootouts at Gustafson Lake. What a good dog. And this is when the police began shooting, a dog began biting the police. We're also seeing Commander. This is a very recent story, Joe Biden's dogs. So both of Joe Biden's dogs have been Secret Service agents, don't bite anybody else. And many of us have pointed out that animals know those Secret Service agents are Trumpers. The dogs are only biting them, and animals very much know when there's a threat to their loved one. And so we could perhaps see that dog as well, Commander, as engaging in these forms of resistance. I know I'm at time, so I'm going to stop there, and we have some time for questions. Thank you.
We do have one in the chat. It's a bit long. I might actually get you to just read it out and decide. There's like 3 cards too.
Oh yes, it's Yuri. Hi Yuri. Yeah. Okay, so where are the animal rights organizations like PETA on the use of animals? Yeah, people have a lot of critique of PETA. So there's often animal rights is usually phrased as feminine, middle class, and privileged. So it's rich woman, and it's very much feminized for particular reasons. But you often will see PETA will engage in stuff like, throwing blood on celebrities, but they tend to not engage in these kind of issues where there's deeper connections to movement. So that's one of the critiques of PETA. As I said, they often will instrumentalize other movements for justice. So talk about animal slavery, animals are treated as slaves, while of course not actually working with Black groups to address Black liberation. Any progress on Black, Indigenous, or eco groups led by social, racial, environmental justice groups in Canada? Yeah, this is the difficulty. So I kind of mentioned this, that one of the critiques that we have within kind of the split in animal studies, and there's reasons why people do want penalties for animal abuse. It's often a sign of future like psychosis and abuse, right? So often like mass shooters and abusers will begin by abusing animals. So there's this idea that you need to intervene in it and we should have these penalties because if someone's abusing animals, they often go on to harm humans. Domestic abusers will often abuse their partner's pet. There's a lot of that, like threatening your pet. So I'm not suggesting there's not a reason behind this, but of course, then we get into the idea of like harsh penalties rather than saying like, how do we intervene in violence? How do we treat patriarchal and male violence? Like, what are the roots of that? And how do we as a society address that? Because we know zero tolerance hasn't actually done anything to stop domestic violence and address gender-based violence. We know we need broader social approaches. So we see the same thing with animals, but animal groups tend to be focused on that rather than, I mentioned like the Humane Society was very instrumental in Quanto's law, but of course has not been instrumental in thinking about why Indigenous people are victims. Now you're asking about veganism? Yeah. So yeah, this is like, if you ever go to an animal studies conference, like 70% of the conference will be people angsting about, can we tell people that they should be vegans? I'm not gonna get into it, I guess, but this is like a source of great angst. And of course, obviously the difference between Indigenous, sustainable hunting, like, so often PETA comes in and critiques like the seal hunt, but of course, in Inuit people are like, this is our culture, we hunt in a respectful way. So I'm not here to tell you to be a vegan or not. I'm just saying that, yes, that is the number one dilemma at an animal conference is like, is it really privileged to tell people what they can and can't eat? Obviously, it can be difficult to have a vegan diet. It's like not accessible to people. It's very classist in some ways. What if people have eating disorders? What if people have medical needs? So it's difficult to think about, but what we can think about is animal production. So many of us, what we call companion animals, like 1% of our animals, as I said, are companion animals like cats and dogs who are obviously treated well. 99% of animals in Canada are under industrial farming production. And so whether or not you want to eat meat, you can certainly think about those conditions and what that means. And we should be challenging laws that prevent us from knowing about that. So there's, for example, the Excelsior farm very recently, 3 people trespassed that farm in order to get the media to come and see the conditions, and they received jail time. This is in like Surrey, BC. So we have a very, very harsh criminal regime against people that stand in solidarity with animals. You'll see many people infiltrate farms and work there just to get pictures of what's happening. And if you're caught, you get harsh criminal penalties. So at the very least, we can think about that. How do we fight radical? Okay, Yuri, I'll get to the rest of you later. What are my thoughts on puppy raising programs in prisons? Yeah, so the puppy program at Nova is actually one of the best rated dog training programs. So they train assistance dogs. I don't have a problem with it. The problem I have with it is that 50% of women with, like 50% of incarcerated women are women with disabilities. So I find an irony in the idea that these women are not given tools they need to treat their disability, and we incarcerate them, and then we're like, oh, but you can train these dogs that you're yourself not going to be eligible for as a trauma animal. But that said, similar to the issue of prison farms, many people have found that extremely therapeutic and healing. Canada used to have prison farms. There's a very successful prison farm outside of Kingston, and many of the people said that that was what they really transformed them. So we know that relationships with animals are important in healing. If you don't know, we shut down all the prison farms, both the food and the animal farms. And then we decided they were going to reconstitute the prison farm at Kingston, but it's a commercial goat farming enterprise that's going to create baby formula to send to China to the same company that had like that poison baby formula. So it's like commercial production of goat milk. And so the animals are now going to essentially be incarcerated themselves. So rather than like a farming idea where like the animals are free and people are able to interact with the animals and everybody heals, it's now like the goats are going to be like crammed into these commercial pens, and the prisoners will simply like, you know, clean up their shit. And then we're going to export that. So completely not the idea of prison farms. Although I should say that the first prison farms were actually on Indigenous land, like in Ontario, and they were specifically used as land theft. And then they would incarcerate the Indigenous people on the farm with the idea of teaching them the correct relationship to animals. So since Indigenous people didn't capitalistically relate to animals, prison farms were actually an early mode of being like, you should like, we'll incarcerate you on this farm so you can treat animals as production and not as like companions or spiritual beings. Do you have any other questions? Go ahead.
Every time I hear you speak, I get a gut response, and I love it. As a white settler and a dog lover, this was excellent because I also can't stand cops. What do you think? I'm curious. It's a different animal, but the heroism that they put into the horses, that they you know, let them shit in the street on Le Marchand Street, and yet then they're going to ticket the next person that doesn't clean up their dog's dung. You know, what is the point of this horse thing? And what's happening to the horses after they're out of commission?
Yeah, the police horse thing. I sort of settled on dogs because there was so much dog stuff. But the horse thing, and especially horses, have a long history in anti-worker protests. Like, if you see where police use horses, it's overwhelmingly to like storm protests. It's literally to put them above you, and like it comes from the military usage as well. Yeah, so I literally just saw that same tweet about like the horse shit like on the road, but like God help you if you litter, but police horses can shit anywhere. But beyond that, yeah, it's interesting too because horses have become, of course, steadily more obsolete. So we've gone from horses as so much part of our everyday life, where, you know, 1 in 5 people like had a horse and they were the main form of transport, to, of course, horses are now tend to be either very wealthy people, maybe if you're in a rural situation, and then police. So we don't have the same relationship with horses that we had for generations, which was a co-worker relationship where horses were so vital and people had all of those tools. And now they're so tied to policing. It's equally violent. The horses, of course, they use them to like crush protesters, so people will fight back on the horses. You do have penalties for doing that. So we'll frequently see people throwing stuff at the horses. Marbles is a common thing to like cause the horses to slip. I did have in like, these are like multiple talks put together, but in one of the talks I did have a stream on horses, and there was a bit about how like in Australia, this horse, like a protester like hit back on a horse or something, and then everybody was like sending the horse oats and like food and the same kind of thing, like what a good horse, like we should all love this horse. At the same time, of course, yeah, like we're getting rid of the grasslands where horses move freely. Like our treatment of the environment is obviously directly related to the ability of horses to live their life. So same thing, like not used in the same ways, but yeah, very much like particularly used in like traffic and policing in these like extremely violent ways. Horses actually have a long history of military use.
Are they put down after the?
I don't actually know. I couldn't say that because like my research is on dogs, but I wouldn't. I mean, they probably sent to some farm somewhere. I would guess that you eventually like send them out and somebody takes them. I imagine it's like those animal sanctuaries, but I don't know. And I imagine too that you may have many of the same problems as in like once you train a horse for a particular activity. Like animals have mental health, like drug sniffing dogs become addicted to the drugs and depressed. Dogs that are used in search and rescue, which you may say, okay, that's different, that's not violence. But if the dogs don't find people, they actually become traumatized. And you actually have to like fake people finding at various points, because if the animals can't find people, they know that they're failing and they become psychologically distressed. So we have to understand that animals are their own beings. They have full psychology, some of which is not accessible to us. And when we begin using them to our own ends, we have no idea what the impact is on those animals to be repeatedly, you know, if you're a horse, repeatedly walking a route and not being able to go out and be in nature, not being able to be around other horses in the way you'd be, not be able to communicate. We do not know the impact we have on animals because we cannot understand animal psychology. But we need to understand that and recognize that animals, fundamentally, animals are not here for us. Animals are their own beings. They have agency. They have lives apart from us. We are allowed to enter those lives in particular ways. There's nothing wrong with loving your cat, but we still need to understand that that cat and dog is not us. And we need to further extend that and think about, like, why do we believe we have ownership of animals? Why do we believe we somehow know them? Why do we believe we have rights to them in any kind of way? Why can't we leave them alone? Why can't we preserve their habitats and let them live and recognize that they have their own societies that are not us? And fundamentally, our lack of belief in that makes us think that because animals don't have souls and, you know, we're closest to God and whatever religious, moral, philosophical ideas, that then we have the right to do whatever we want. And at its sort of most violent, it's policing, but I would argue that it's also everything we do to animals, eating them, putting them on leashes. Go ahead.
Where do you think the idea, you mentioned it was okay to love your cat, and I keep thinking of all these Facebook posts where people talk about the fur babies And this idea that, because it's interesting among animal lovers as a Facebook group, just talking that particular, there is this whole thing where, okay, we don't call them owner anymore. We're now, you know, fur mom and fur dad. And, you know, just wondering where I have ideas myself when I think of this, but where would we situate that?
I literally saw a post this morning by this person, and I have to say it's like they were like white people, so you know, they were diagnosing it as social alienation, like as we become more alienated from each other, as it's less possible to have human families, as we don't have our extended families, as many of us migrate, as we're, you know, online, and that we hyper invest into our animal companions because we lack many of the forms of social solidarity that traditionally would have sustained us. So they suggested that. I think there's some truth to that. I mean, this is part of the problem if I want to take this into animal rights. Typically, a lot of people think like Black people are violent. Like we get, like, among the many things that Black people get accused of, not liking animals is one of them. But if you are in the South, like the Caribbean, like the global South, people leave dogs alone and stuff, but there's often like community dogs. So there's a different model where you don't like kiss the dog on the mouth and let him sleep in your bed, but there'll be dogs that roam the community and they're given freedom, and then people will feed them. You often see this like in Turkey with the cats, where they're just like, they're stray, but then there's a care for them. So there are these models of caring for animals and living alongside animals, but not feeling like, you know, you need to claim the animal as your child. I mean, you've seen my office. If you see my office, it's all like stuffed animals and stuff. So I'm not like critiquing you if you like, you know, carry your dog around in a bag. I would probably like to have a dog in a bag too. But I do think that, yeah, it does suggest, I guess my critique of it would be, again, like, how does that encourage us to not understand that animals actually are separate from us? When we say like, that is my baby, you know, like, does that create a philosophical move where we're therefore like, okay, if I am an animal, then I have particular boundary crossings that I can do. But I don't have like I said, I don't have a problem with it. Like dogs, you know, we've been with dogs for like thousands. Our oldest relationship is humans and dogs. We're not gonna break that now. Like, you know, that's fine. Dogs are gonna chill with us.
I just think so much of it, I actually think, is about power and control, that human relationships are more complicated, messy, and require care. With animals, people use it, it's this very benign idea, you know, they're my fur babies, but okay, the reason you lavish on them is you have power and control over them, and you don't have to, in theory, although it doesn't always work in practice, depending on the animal's temperament, you don't have to negotiate with them as you do with a human being, right? And people often say, oh, you know, animals give unconditional love and they don't judge you and criticize you. Well, that's another way of saying, yeah, they have no agency. And since they have no agency, you can impose upon them your own emotional needs, and they become,
and then, yeah, if an animal,
they become a sentient stuffed animal.
like if an animal's not like loving in the right way.
No.
I frequently like animals that don't give a fuck about human. I always respect them. Like my neighbor has like, I call him the hallway kitty. So they have this like feral cat that literally like only wants treats, and like God help you if you try to touch the cat. Like there's like, just give me the food and F off. And I'm like, I respect that. Like that cat is not about you. But people don't like that. They want, yeah, the animal that's going to soothe you. And I think you're right. Yeah, I think, but it has to do with like profound human alienation, right? That as we become more alienated from affection, we lavish that upon animals.
My family had this cat for many years named Rusty, and he was one of those cats, one pat, two pat, third pat,
Yeah.
overstimulate easily. And, you know, my parents always kind of blamed themselves for that because they did a little roughhousing with him when he was a kitten, right? But I just think he was one of those, you know, usually when they nip after petting, they just overstimulated. I just think he was an easily overstimulated cat. And it's just interesting how my family had to learn, we had to work around the cat. Because, you know, my dad tried to do this and tell the cat what to do, typical, you know, older white guy of his generation, right? 50s, power and control. Don't you do this? And the cat wasn't having any of that. And Dad ignored it. And then when it puffed up like this, he had to go to the ER, right? He learned how to, he said, I have to teach the cat who's boss. And I kind of thinking, well, Dad, I think the cat has established who's the boss here.
Well, that's like animal
And
training.
those are the kind of cats that get, like when my parents started to go to Florida, they had to rehouse him. You can't leave him by himself, even if he wasn't very social. And they had to look very carefully because he wasn't a kid cat and he wasn't we were very lucky. We found a lady who liked high needs cats, right? Just you're talking about the high needs dogs, right? And gave him a very loving home until he passed away. We were all very grateful for that because it's rare.
Yeah, I mean, I think very quickly, so the idea of training, like there's obviously the training that an animal mother gives her children, which is how to integrate into animal society, but so much of our training is geared towards making animals compliant and obedient to us, which isn't necessarily the training an animal needs to survive. And I will say very quickly that dog breeding, in fact, is highly tied to eugenics, and the rise of the breeding of dogs and the notion of the purebred dog is directly taking place during the 19th century, the same time as scientific racism and the whole idea of like human hierarchies of blood, and that was not separate. There was explicit rhetoric around certain types of dogs are like noble dogs, good dogs, and just like certain types of humans. So it's actually very racialized how we like think about animals. Very much is filtered through racialized thinking. That's when they started the Kennel Club. It's not separate, it's deeply tied into the racialization of humans and then the correct training of the dog in order for the dog to be in its correct place. So you're not wrong at all there.
Well, I want to thank you for giving this talk because I joked with you when you first came in. I try not to miss anything you do because I learn so much from you. And I try to take that back into my own classes and share that with the students, right? And I think what you do, which is a good thing for me, it's uncomfortable but good. It reminds me, okay, am I talking about these things as much as I need to be talking with my sociology students and my students in other programs, right? And it's always kind of interesting, thought-provoking, okay, in terms of, okay, should I be going deeper into these and what should I be sharing? And yeah, so no, it's a great talk, and with your permission, I might play the recording for my crime course, so unless you want to come in yourself.
I will say that my partner hates that I do this. He's like, F you, they're gonna give reparations to dogs before they get them. Although very quick, sorry, I know we're out of time, so you can go eat if you want, but my partner hates like animals. Very performatively so. It's like his sort of public trolling. So when I was going to like these animal conferences, I'm like, you probably don't want to go. Like, and he's like, no, I want to come. And I mistakenly taught him the term animal sovereigntist. I said, well, you're an animal sovereigntist. You don't believe that humans should interfere with animals. So then we go to like Oxford, and of course they're like, oh, what do you do? Are you also an animal scholar? And he goes, no, I'm more of an animal sovereigntist. Well, everybody was like, oh my gosh, so interesting. What they like him more than me. He's on the Oxford homepage. So now when he's trolling people about animals, he's like, oh yeah, well, I go to Oxford and the animal people like so I'm like, I hate you. But yeah, just to say it's kind of funny. All right, I'll let you guys go. Thank you so much for listening.
It's a bit long, so it's Krista. I think it's Krista Collier-Jarvis saying, thank you so much for your amazing talk. You started to speak about animals as an early sign of domestic abuse, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are regarding the implication of animals in genocide, not necessarily as a tool of genocide wielded by the perpetrators, but as an extension of the culture being targeted.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Coast Salish bulldogs, and this is actually very, very common that you will see an accompanying genocide of local animals when settler colonists move in. So, of course, the genocide of the Coast Salish bulldogs was directly tied to breaking ceremonial blankets, right? So blankets are so central to the potlatch culture. That was a culture of going around giving gifts. It was anti-capitalist, right? Because you're giving away what you have, and it involved traveling, so you couldn't hold people in residential school and at church. And so, of course, we know the Indian agents and governments were deeply focused on breaking that relationship, and part of that was killing the dogs. So even though this isn't really acknowledged, they'll often just say the dogs disappeared. There is a painting. I actually did this whole paper on like dogs and paintings in Canada, and there is a very famous painting by Paul Kane of like this beautiful white dog in the context of these wool dogs, and that's one record we have of it. But yeah, like this was a direct act, and it's very much tied to breaking cultural relationships or even cultural production, but specifically the idea that Indigenous people are not relating to animals in the correct way. So in capitalism, an animal should be a worker. You should dominate that animal. It produces for you, or it works in the mine. I shouldn't say it. They work in the mines. So, you know, the horses were used in munitions for a long time in the military as cavalry charges. Animals were working animals. And so the idea that Indigenous people didn't see animals that way and saw animals as these, you know, part of a spirituality in a relationship, having souls, that you know, hunted in these ethical ways, that was deeply anti-capitalist. And so there was a huge investment in, yes, like committing genocide against animals as a form of genocide against Indigenous people as well. So in order to completely break relationships with land, to break spiritual relationships, to break production, so how people are using animals in order to produce goods, you know, all of that is fundamental to colonialism. So, and same thing with slavery, like dogs are so instrumental to slavery. So we cannot think about these incredible violent histories without understanding the implications of animals. Thank you, Krista. You probably know more in a Mi'kmaq context than I do, but thank you for that question, because yeah, it's really important.
Before you all depart, I wanted to say thank you again to Al for an amazing, thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much for doing that. Very grateful. And just also thank you for joining us. So those of you who are here in person, thank you for being here, spending time with us. Thank you to those of you online. And if you do have other topics or potential speakers for the Black and Indigenous Speaker Series that you would like us to make happen, please send your email to Liz, and Liz will work on that. We do have a feedback form which Liz will also send out to you, and we'd be grateful for your feedback on this series. The series is meant for the MSVU community, so please, your thoughts are very welcome. Again, thank you so much, Elle. It was a pleasure having you here.